My nephew came to see me in November of 1921, the year I finally decided to sell the store. He was a school teacher by then, 26 years old, with ink-stained fingers and the particular kind of patience that comes from spending your days explaining things to children who would rather be outdoors. He had been writing a history of the county, nothing grand, just a small bound record he intended to leave at the library, and he had been asking around town for stories worth keeping. Someone had sent him to me. We sat in the back room of Morrow & Sons, the same back room where I had eaten lunch every working day for 31 years. The stove was going. Outside, the first real cold of the season had settled over the plains and was not moving. Through the single window, the land looked the way Kansas land always looks in November, flat, brown, waiting. No hills to speak of, no trees except the ones people had planted themselves. Just the long, open reach of it, running west until it ran out of names. My nephew had a notebook. He set it on the table and looked at me with that school-teacher patience of his and asked if I remembered the winter of 1883. I told him I remembered every winter. He smiled at that. He asked if anything particular stood out. I was quiet for a while, not because I had to think. I was quiet because I had told pieces of this story to different people over the years, a sentence here, a detail there, but I had never told it whole. I was not sure I had ever wanted to. There is a difference between a story that is finished and a story you have simply stopped telling. This one was the second kind. I told my nephew that before I began, he should understand one thing. The history of this county, as most people tell it, is a history of things that were built. Cabins, barns, fences, roads, the church, the mill. Things you can point to and say, here, this is what we made. And that is true as far as it goes. But there is another kind of history, the history of things that were figured out quietly, without announcements, by people nobody was watching carefully enough. That history is harder to write down. It tends to belong to people who did not think of themselves as making history at all. He said he understood. I said I was not sure anyone fully understood it until they were old enough to look back and see the shape of it. Then I told him about the winter of 1883 and about a woman named Marta Sundqvist and about a curlicue of smoke rising from a building that nobody could find. The first thing you have to understand about that particular stretch of Kansas is the wood problem. People who have never lived on the open plains sometimes imagine that frontier life meant living among trees. They picture dense forest, tall timber, the sound of axes in the morning. That was true in parts of the country. It was not true here. What we had was grass. Grass in every direction. Grass taller than a man's waist in a wet year. Grass that turned gold in August and pale silver in October and rattled in the wind all winter like something trying to get in. Grass we had in abundance. Trees we did not. The first settlers who came through used buffalo chips for fuel, dried dung from the great herds that had passed through a generation before. It burned well enough, and it was free, and there was a time when you could collect a winter's worth of it in a single afternoon if you knew where to look. But by 1883, the herds were gone, and the families had multiplied, and the only wood available was what the railroad brought in from the east, cut and bundled, and sold at prices that climbed a little higher with each passing season. A cabin of ordinary size with ordinary insulation required a serious amount of wood to survive a Kansas winter. Most families knew this and planned accordingly. They stacked their wood piles against the north wall before October and watched those piles shrink through the cold months with a kind of low, steady anxiety that became part of the texture of winter life, the way hunger becomes part of the texture of a long journey. You did not panic. You simply counted and calculated and hoped the cold would break before the pile did. In the autumn of 1883, there were more families in the county than there had ever been before, and the wood supply had not grown to match them. Prices that fall were already a third higher than the year before. I noted it in my ledger and felt uneasy about what February might bring. That is the backdrop. That is the ground the story grew out of, Now I will tell you about Lars Sunkvist, because you cannot understand Marta without understanding what she had already lost before the real trouble began. Lars came into my store for the first time in the spring of 1881. He was a Swedish man, quiet in the way that some people are quiet, not shy exactly, but deliberate, as though he had decided early in life that words were valuable and ought not to be wasted. He was a blacksmith by trade, or had been in Sweden. Here he was trying to become a farmer, which is the story of most of the men who came through in those years. He had a small claim east of town, a rented cabin on land belonging to Harold Keene, and a wife and a daughter not yet 2 years old. His English was careful and imperfect in the way that a man's English is when he has learned it from books rather than from people. He made himself understood. He paid his accounts on time and to the penny. He said thank you in a way that made you believe he meant it. Marta came into the store with him that first day, holding the baby on her hip. I remember thinking that she had the kind of face that does not give much away, not cold but watchful. She looked around the store the way a person looks around a new room they will have to learn to live in, taking inventory, noting distances. She spoke less English than Lars. She learned it faster. They were in the county for a year and a half before the diphtheria came through in the autumn of 1882. It was not a large outbreak, as outbreaks went, but it moved quickly, and it did not choose carefully. Lars Sunkvist took sick in early October and was dead before the month ended. He was 37 years old. Their daughter Ingrid was 3. I will not dwell on that period. The county lost several people that fall, and grief was not in short supply. What I will say is that I saw Marta twice in the 2 weeks after Lars died, and both times she came to the store alone, and both times she bought what she needed and nothing else, and both times she paid without a word about her situation. I did not ask. I have thought about that many times since. Harold Keene was not a hard man by nature, though circumstances had made him a precise one. He owned 7 rental properties in and around the county, and he managed them the way a man manages something he cannot afford to lose, carefully, without sentiment, according to the terms of the agreements he had made. When Lars died, the cabin on Keene's land still had 11 months left on a 2-year lease that Lars had signed with the intention of eventually buying the property outright. Lars had been behind on the final payments. The intention had been there. The money had not quite followed it. Keene gave Marta time. This is something I want to say plainly because it would be easy to make him a villain, and the truth is more complicated than that. He gave her the better part of a year. He came to her in September of 1883, not October or November, which would have been crueler. He came with the lease agreement in hand, and a family from Ohio waiting to take the property. And he told her what the papers said. Ingrid was 4 years old by then and spoke English better than her mother. She was the one who translated. I heard about this later from a woman who had been visiting a neighbor nearby. She said she had seen Ingrid standing in the doorway of the cabin with her small, serious face, turning her mother's Swedish into English and Keene's English back into Swedish, word by careful word, while the autumn wind moved through the grass around them. Marta listened to the full translation. Then she nodded once and asked how long she had. Keene said she had until the end of the month. She nodded again. He left. She did not argue. She did not weep in front of him, if she wept at all. I saw her 8 days later. It was a Tuesday morning in early October, cool but not yet cold. The sky the particular pale blue of Kansas autumn that is beautiful in a way that somehow makes you lonesome. She came into the store before I had finished opening the shutters. Ingrid was with her, holding her hand, already looking around the store with that same watchful quality her mother had. Marta set 4 things on my counter. 3 burlap sacks, the large kind, the ones farmers use for grain. 1 coil of rope 40 feet, 1 small tin of beef tallow, 1 packet of children's cough remedy. Ingrid had been fighting a cough since early September. She counted out her coins slowly, carefully. the way you count when you know the exact number in your pocket and need every one of them to land correctly. Her hands did not shake. I have thought about those hands more times than I can tell you. After everything that had happened to her, Lars gone, the cabin lost, a sick child and a Kansas winter coming on, her hands were steady on my counter as a carpenter's level. I put her goods in a cloth sack and did not ask about the rope or the burlap. A storekeeper learns early that curiosity is a fine thing in its place, and its place is not behind the counter. What I did wonder, quietly, as I watched her walk out into that October morning, was what a woman with a sick child and nowhere to live intended to do with 40 feet of rope and 3 grain sacks. I found out, eventually. The whole county found out, in one way or another, before that winter was through. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is the trouble with being old and telling stories. You can see the whole shape of the thing from where you sit, and it is hard to remember that at the time nobody could see past the next cold morning. At the time, all anyone knew was that Marta Sundqvist had walked out of my store with a coil of rope and a sick daughter, and nothing else in the world that was legally hers. And Thomas Jenkins, who was leaning against the post outside my store when she passed, Jenkins, who had built half the cabins in the county and was proud of it, watched her go and said to no one in particular, "That Swedish woman won't last till Christmas." He said it without malice. He said it the way a man states a fact about weather. He was wrong, as it turned out. But that morning, standing in my doorway watching her walk east into the pale October light, I was not sure I would have bet against him. Before I tell you what Marta built, I have to tell you what she found. Because the building came from the finding, and the finding came from the kind of accident that does not feel like an accident once you have lived long enough to see how such things tend to arrange themselves. In the summer of 1882, a few months before the diphtheria came through, Lars Sunkvist had attended an estate auction out on the Brandt property. Old Werner Brandt had died that spring. Heart, the doctors said, though some of us thought it was more a matter of having decided he was finished. He had come to this county in 1851, which made him one of the first, and 30 years of Kansas weather will finish a man as surely as anything. His wife Cecilia was still living, but she was 67 years old and could not manage the property alone, and so the larger items were sold. Lars had gone looking for tools. He bought a post-hole digger and a set of iron hinges, and somewhere in the miscellany of the auction, the boxes of accumulated decades that always appear at such events, the things too small to price individually and too numerous to examine, he bought a flat pine box with a simple latch for 30 cents. He brought it home and set it on the shelf above the door and apparently never opened it, or if he did, found nothing in it worth reporting. After he died, Marta moved the box with everything else, and it sat on a shelf in the rented cabin until the day she packed her belongings into a canvas bag and carried them out of that cabin for the last time. She took the box because it had been Lars's. That was reason enough. I know the next part of the story because Marta told it to me herself years later when she had enough English to tell it precisely. She said she opened the box for the first time on the second night after she left the cabin. She was sleeping under a lean-to she had constructed against the lee side of a shallow creek bank east of town. Not much shelter, but the bank cut the wind, and she had her quilt and Ingrid pressed close against her side. Ingrid's cough had eased a little with the medicine. The child slept. Marta did not. She lay awake listening to the wind move across the grass above her and thinking about the burlap sacks, which she had bought with a purpose that was not yet fully formed. She had an idea, or the outline of an idea, the way you sometimes have the shape of a word before you have the word itself. She had grown up in the Dalarna region of Sweden, in a farmhouse her grandfather had built into the side of a low hill. The back wall of that house was earth, packed hard and thick, and her grandmother had kept a storage cellar dug into the same hill, lined with timber and insulated between the boards with compressed dry grass and straw. In January, when the Swedish cold came down and the air outside would freeze a wet cloth solid in 20 minutes, the temperature inside that cellar held steady and mild. Her grandmother kept root vegetables there, and crocks of preserved meat, and occasionally a lamb that was too young to survive the open barn. The earth keeps things, her grandmother had told her once. It does not forget summer the way the air does. Marta had thought about this from time to time during her Kansas winters. She had thought about it with the wistfulness of a person thinking about something from home that does not translate. Sweden had hills. Sweden had slopes to build into. Kansas had neither. The land here was flat as a palm, and the cold that came across it came without obstruction, without mercy, from every direction at once. Or so she had believed. She was lying awake in the dark beside her sleeping daughter, turning this over in her mind when she thought of the pine box. She did not know why she thought of it precisely then. She sat up, found it in her bag by feel, and brought it close to the small stub of candle she had been conserving carefully. Inside was a book, small, no larger than her hand, bound in dark cloth that had softened with age. She opened it and found pages covered in a careful, cramped script. German, not Swedish, but close enough in places that she could make out words here and there. Dates, measurements, drawings in the margins, the kind a person makes when they are trying to think through a problem in 3 dimensions. 2 parallel lines with a space between them, hatched and cross-hatched, arrows indicating direction. Numbers she could not yet interpret. She could not read most of it. But she understood, looking at those drawings, that whoever had written this book had been trying to solve a problem she recognized. She closed the box and lay back down beside Ingrid and did not sleep for a long time, but her sleeplessness was a different quality than it had been before. I was the one who told her to go to Cecilia Brandt. She came into the store the following morning with the pine box under her arm and the notebook open on my counter, and she pointed to the German script and asked me if I could read it. I could not. My people were English on both sides, and I had managed to reach 51 years of age without acquiring a second language, but I told her I knew someone who could. I wrote Cecilia Brandt's name and direction on a slip of paper and handed it across the counter. Then, and I am not sure what came over me to do it, I took 3 more burlap sacks from the shelf behind me and added them to the pile of goods she had bought the day before. And I wrote the amount in my ledger under her name without a word about it. She looked at the sacks. She looked at me. I told her the sacks had been sitting too long and I needed the shelf space. She knew that was not true. She did not say so. She took the sacks and the slip of paper and thanked me in the careful way she had, and she and Ingrid went out into the morning. I stood at my counter for a moment after they left, looking at the entry in my ledger. Then I turned the page and started on the morning's inventory, and I did not think about it again for a long time. Cecilia Brandt lived in a small house at the eastern edge of the county, set back from the road behind a stand of cottonwoods she and Werner had planted the first year they arrived. The house was modest but well kept, the kind of place that is maintained out of self-respect rather than expectation of company. Marta arrived at her door that morning with Ingrid at her side and the pine box in her arms. What happened in the next 2 hours, I can only tell you secondhand. Marta told it to me years later, and some of it Cecilia herself confirmed in the one long conversation I had with her the following spring, before her health made conversation difficult. So I will tell it as I understand it, which may not be complete, but is as close to true as I can manage. Cecilia opened the door and looked at the woman on her step for a moment without speaking. Then she looked at the pine box. Her expression changed in a way that Marta said she could not fully describe. Something moving behind the eyes, some old door opening. She said in German, "Where did you get that?" Marta said her husband had bought it at auction. Werner Brandt's estate, the summer before last. Cecilia was quiet. Then she stepped back from the door and let them in. She took the notebook from Marta's hands and sat down at her kitchen table with it, and Marta said that watching her read it was like watching a person read a letter from someone they had believed was dead. Her lips moved slightly. Her fingers did not turn the pages quickly. After a while, Cecilia looked up and told Marta that she had written this notebook in the winter of 1852. She had been 21 years old. She and Werner had arrived in Kansas the previous autumn, too late in the season to build a proper cabin before the cold came. They had spent that first winter in a structure that was half underground, walls of packed earth with dry grass compressed between a double thickness of sod, a roof of earth over a frame of cut saplings. It had been, she said, the warmest shelter she had ever lived in, before or since. When they finally built their timber cabin the following year, she had helped Werner pull the earth structure down. She did not remember deciding to write the notebook. She remembered only that it had seemed important to record what they had learned in case they ever needed to know it again. She supposed she had put it in the box and forgotten it. She had told 2 people about the earth house over the years. One had laughed, the other had listened politely and changed the subject. She said all of this to Marta quietly, in German, which Marta understood perhaps 2/3 of. Ingrid, who was sitting at the edge of the room watching everything with those steady eyes of hers, translated what she could. Then Cecilia looked at the burlap sacks Marta had set just inside the door, and the rope and the tallow, and she asked Marta, without preamble, what she intended to build. Here is what Marta intended. She had found, 2 days after leaving the cabin, a low spot at the edge of a vacant quarter section east of town where the land was not entirely flat. A shallow depression, perhaps 4 feet lower than the surrounding ground, where a seasonal creek had cut a gentle bank over many years. Not a hill, not a slope, but a slight elevation on the windward side, enough to work with. Her plan, as she explained it to Cecilia in mixed Swedish and German, with Ingrid bridging the gaps, was to build 2 parallel walls of packed earth along the sheltered inner face of that bank, with the bank itself forming the back wall. The 2 earth walls would run parallel, 18 inches apart. The space between them would be filled with dry grass compressed into dense blocks. Not loose grass, but grass packed tightly enough that it could not settle or shift. The outer wall would face north and west, where the winter wind came from. The inner wall would face the interior of the shelter. Between them, the compressed grass would form a layer of insulation that no amount of wind could penetrate. A roof of packed earth over a timber frame, grass-covered and thick, would complete the enclosure. She would need, she said, about 3 weeks of good working days. Cecilia listened to all of this without interrupting. When Marta finished, there was a long silence in the small kitchen. Then Cecilia opened the notebook to a page near the middle and turned it around so Marta could see. On the page was a drawing of exactly the construction Marta had described: 2 parallel walls in cross-section, the space between them hatched heavily to indicate the grass insulation, arrows showing the direction of prevailing wind, a notation in German beside the outer wall. Marta looked at the drawing for a moment. Then she looked at Cecilia. The old woman tapped the notation with one finger. "Pack it tighter than you think necessary," she said. "My husband thought he had packed it tight enough. He had not. Compress it until your hands ache. Then compress it again." She paused. "Also," she said, "you will need to leave a gap at the top of the inner wall, only a finger's width. The moisture from breath and fire must have somewhere to go, or the grass will rot before February." She closed the notebook. She held it for a moment, then she held it out to Marta. "Keep it," she said. "I have had it long enough. It should be used." Construction began the following Monday. The depression east of town was on unoccupied land, a quarter section that had been claimed and abandoned twice, the kind of parcel that passes through hands without anyone quite managing to make it productive. Nobody questioned Marta's right to build there, mostly because nobody was paying close enough attention to question anything. The soil along that shallow bank was good clay sand, dense and stable, the kind of earth that holds shape when you work it. Marta broke ground with the iron shovel she had carried out of the cabin among her permitted belongings, the small one Lars had used for the kitchen garden, no longer than her arm. She marked out the dimensions with stakes and the 40 feet of rope, measuring twice the way her grandmother had taught her to measure. Ingrid sat nearby on a folded blanket with her cough medicine and a book from school, reading aloud to herself, in the thin October sunlight. By the end of the first day, Marta had the footings for both walls laid out and the first 6 inches of the outer wall begun. Her hands were raw. Her back understood, in the specific language of the back, that this was going to be several weeks of serious work. She looked at what she had done. It did not look like much. She drove her last stake, picked up the shovel, and went to find Ingrid. They made camp in the creek depression, sheltered from the wind, and ate a supper of cold beans and cornbread she had bought that morning from the baker's wife. The first light frost of the season settled over the grass that night. Marta lay on her side listening to her daughter breathe and thought about her grandmother's cellar in Dalarna. The smell of cold earth and stored apples, the way the silence inside it was different from the silence outside, denser, older, like something that had been kept carefully for a long time. "The earth does not forget summer," she had said. Marta pulled her quilt closer and watched the stars move slowly over Kansas and waited for morning. The second day of construction, the outer wall collapsed. Not the whole of it, just the section she had built highest, perhaps 2 feet of packed earth along the northwest corner that came down in the early morning when the night's frost released and the clay shifted. She arrived at the site to find it slumped into a low mound at the base of the stakes, as though the wall had simply decided to lie down and rest. She stood looking at it for a while. Then she set down her shovel and sat on the folded blanket beside Ingrid and ate half a piece of cornbread and thought about what the wall had told her by falling. This is something I came to understand about Marta only gradually over many years of knowing her. She did not experience setbacks the way most people do. Most people, when something fails, feel the failure first and think second. Marta seemed to think and feel at the same time, as though for her they were not separate processes. She looked at a problem the way she had looked around my store that first morning, taking inventory, noting distances, working out what the thing in front of her actually required. What the wall required, she determined, was a different method of packing. She had been building it in horizontal layers, the way she had seen men build adobe in the pictures in Lars's almanac. Pack a layer, let it set slightly, pack another layer on top. It was a logical approach. It was also, she now understood, wrong for this particular soil, in this particular temperature, in this particular season. The clay here had too much sand in it to bond cleanly between layers when the cold got into it overnight. The frost was finding the seams. She needed to pack vertically instead, driving the earth inward and downward, compressing each section as a single mass rather than as accumulated courses. More work, slower. But the wall would be one piece instead of many, and one piece would hold. She rebuilt the fallen section that afternoon and did not lose it again. By the end of the first week, both walls stood to shoulder height. From a distance, from the road, say, or from the slight rise where the Hayes property began, the construction site looked like nothing in particular. 2 low earthen ridges running parallel, pale brown against the pale brown grass, easy to miss if you were not looking for them. The shallow bank of the old creek formed the back wall, faced now with packed clay and tallow sealed at the base to discourage water intrusion. Marta had left the finger-width gap at the top of the inner wall exactly as Cecilia had instructed, a detail so small that anyone glancing at the structure would not have noticed it at all. Jenkins noticed it. He came by on a Thursday afternoon, the second week of October, still mild enough that the sky had a certain false warmth to it that made you forget what was coming. He was passing on his way to look at a timber order east of town, or so he said later. I suspected he had heard something and was curious, the way a craftsman is curious when he hears about someone else's method. He stood at the edge of the site for several minutes, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the 2 walls. Marta was working on the roof framework, light sapling poles she had cut from the cottonwoods along the creek, nothing heavier than she could lift alone, notched at the ends to rest on the tops of the walls, without requiring iron hardware she did not have. She was aware of him standing there, She did not stop working. Jenkins walked around the structure once. He crouched down and pressed a thumb into the outer wall. The clay was dense and did not give. He stood up and looked at the gap at the top of the inner wall. He looked at the 18-inch space between the walls, where the first of the grass bundles were already in place, stacked flat and compressed, pale gold in the afternoon light. He said, "That gap will let cold in." Marta looked at him. She said, "It lets wet out." Jenkins was quiet for a moment. He said, "Wet from what?" She said, "From us, from the fire." He looked at the gap again. You could see him turning it over, a craftsman's mind working whether it wanted to or not. Then he straightened up, put his hands back in his pockets, and looked at the grass bundles. "Burlap sacks on the outside face," he said. She said yes, stretched tight and tallow-sealed to keep the wind from finding any looseness in the grass blocks beneath. Jenkins stood there another moment. Then he said the thing he had come to say, which was that it would not stand a Kansas winter, and she would be better served putting her labor toward finding a family in town who would take her in for the season. He said it, I believe, because he meant it. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had spent 25 years learning how buildings failed, and his honest assessment was that this one would. Marta thanked him for coming by. She went back to notching her roof poles. Jenkins walked back to the road. He paused once and looked back at the site, though he did not seem to know he had done it, and then he went on. The second failure came at the end of the second week and was the more serious one. She had the roof framework in place by then, a good tight lattice of saplings covered with 4 inches of packed earth and a final layer of dense sod cut from the surrounding ground and laid grass side down. The walls were complete, the grass insulation packed in 16-inch blocks to the full height, the burlap facing stretched and sealed. She had built the door frame from lumber, the one purchased item in the entire construction, 6 feet of rough-cut pine board she had bought from my store on a Tuesday morning, counted out in coins that had required some time to assemble. She had moved inside. She and Ingrid slept on a pallet of cut grass covered with oilcloth, and Marta had built a small fire in the shallow pit she had dug at the center of the floor, vented through a narrow clay-lined channel that rose through the roof to open just above the sod surface. On the 5th morning of living inside, she noticed the smell. It was faint at first, a green, damp smell underneath the wood smoke, the smell of something organic responding to moisture. She pressed her hand against the inner face of the grass insulation at one point, where she had left a small inspection gap. The grass was damp, not wet, but damp, the way grass is after a heavy dew. She sat with this problem for most of the morning. The finger-width gap at the top of the inner wall was doing its work. She could see the slight movement of air there when she held a candle flame near it, but it was not enough. The moisture generated by 2 people sleeping and breathing and cooking in a small enclosed space was moving laterally into the grass insulation rather than rising to the gap. The blocks she had packed so carefully were wicking moisture from the interior air and holding it. She thought about this. She thought about her grandmother's cellar, which had never had this problem. But the cellar had been dug into solid hillside, earth on all sides, no grass insulation to absorb anything. She thought about Cecilia's notebook, which she now knew well enough that she could find any page in it without looking. There was a notation on the 3rd page she had not fully understood when she first read it, a word in German she had asked Ingrid to translate. The word was Zwischenraum, in-between space, interval, the gap between 2 things. She went back to the notebook and read the full sentence around the word slowly, with Ingrid's help. The Zwischenraum must breathe from both sides, Cecilia had written, or it breathes from neither. Marta looked at the inner wall. She looked at the inspection gap. She looked at the base of the inner wall, where it met the clay floor. The gap was only at the top. There was nothing at the bottom. The moisture had nowhere to drain downward. She spent that afternoon cutting a series of small channels at the base of the inner wall, not holes exactly, but slight depressions in the clay at ground level, each one the width of 2 fingers, spaced an arm's length apart. She packed the clay carefully around each channel so the structure did not weaken. Then she covered each opening with a small flat stone, positioned so that air could move beneath it, but a draft could not establish itself. That night the smell did not worsen. By the third morning it was gone. October gave way to November in the way that Kansas seasons change, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a gradual revision, the temperature dropping a few degrees at a time, the wind shifting a point or two further north each week. The days shortening in increments so slow you noticed them mostly in the evenings, when the dark came earlier than you had expected it. I watched the woodpile situation from behind my counter and felt the unease I had felt in September sharpen into something more specific. I was selling fuel faster than my supply could be replenished. The railroad delivery I had expected in the third week of October arrived a week late and 2/3 the size I had ordered. I raised my price, which I hated to do, and noted in my ledger that I would need to ration carefully if the cold stretched past February. I was not the only one doing this arithmetic. You could feel it in the way men talked at the counter, not panicked, not yet, but with the particular quality of attention that frontier people give to a problem that is still manageable and that they very much want to keep that way. Harold Keene came in on a Tuesday in early November and bought a larger order of wood than he had bought at any single time in the 3 years he had been my customer. He stacked it in the back of his wagon with the methodical care of a man who has done his own arithmetic and does not like the answer. I asked him how the cabin was holding up. He said it was tight enough. He said the wind was getting into the north wall worse than last year, and he was going to need to do some work on the chinking before December. He said it the way a man says something he does not quite want to think about too directly. I told him I had some oakum in the back that would serve for chinking. He bought the oakum. He paid and left without the usual exchange of observations about the weather or the state of the county that men fall into at a general store counter when they are not in a hurry. He was in a hurry. Clara Hayes came in that same week with her 2 children and a quietness about her that I recognized. She was a perceptive woman, Clara, the kind of person who sees things slightly before others see them and spends the interval between her seeing and the general acknowledgement in a state of careful private tension. She bought her usual weekly goods and then stood at the counter for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the woodpile stacked against my south wall. She said, "Is it going to be enough, do you think?" I said, "I thought it would be tight." She said, "I went by Marta Sundqvist's place yesterday to bring some bread for the child." I said I was glad to hear it. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That room she built." I stood inside it for about 10 minutes. "It is warmer than my kitchen, Elias," and she had barely any fire going at all. I did not say anything to that. Clara looked at me for a moment with the expression of a woman working out how much weight to put on what she has seen. Then she gathered her children and her goods and went out. I stood at my counter after she left and looked at the woodpile. Then I looked at the page in my ledger where I had written Marta Sundqvist's name and the entry for the 3 extra burlap sacks I had given her. Beside it, in the column I used for account status, I had written the word settled, meaning that I considered the debt closed, for reasons I had not recorded and did not intend to. Outside, the wind picked up from the northwest. The store's north wall creaked once, the way a well-built wall will creak in cold wind. A single low sound like a word spoken in a language you almost understand. November was not finished arriving. December was behind it, and January behind that. And the wood supply in every cabin in the county was going to have to last until the cold decided it was done with us. January came in without warning, the way the worst cold always does on the open plains. There is a particular quality to a Kansas winter that has decided to be serious, something in the air the night before, a stillness that is different from ordinary stillness, as though the land itself has drawn a breath and is holding it. Old settlers learned to read that stillness. They laid in extra wood and checked their door seals and went to bed early and waited for what they knew was coming. The cold arrived on a Tuesday, the 14th of January, 1884. By mid-morning, the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. By afternoon, it was colder than that. The wind came from the northwest at a sustained force that drove fine, dry snow horizontal across the flats and found every gap in every wall in the county and pushed through it like something with intention. The creek east of town froze solid in a single night, not just the surface, but down to the gravel, a thing I had not seen in 20 years of Kansas winters. It stayed that way for 19 days. I will tell you what those 19 days were like from behind my counter, because that is where I spent most of them, and that is what I know directly. By the end of the first week, I had sold every piece of fuel I had in stock. Not rationed, sold, because when a man comes to your counter with children at home, and a look on his face that tells you his woodpile is not going to see him through, you do not ration. You sell him what he needs, and you make a note in your ledger, and you hope the supply wagon gets through from the east before you have to start telling people no. The supply wagon did not get through. The road east was drifted over by the 10th day and did not reopen for 2 weeks after that. Men began burning what they had: fence rails, barn boards from structures that could be sacrificed. One family on the north side of the county burned their wagon bed. I heard of a family that burned their kitchen table and both benches on the same night, and ate standing up for the rest of the winter without apparent complaint, which I always thought said something admirable about them. Harold Keene, I learned later from a neighbor of his, went through his entire winter woodpile by the end of the second week. He pulled down his equipment shed board by board after that and fed the lumber into his stove in lengths, cutting it with a handsaw in the kitchen because it was too cold to work outside for more than a few minutes at a time. By the 19th day, he had burned the shed down to the foundation stones. His cabin was intact. He was warm. But it had cost him everything burnable on his property to achieve it. Thomas Jenkins lost a section of his roof under the weight of accumulated ice. He repaired it himself in temperatures that turned his breath to vapor before it left his face, and later told me it was the hardest physical work he had done in 30 years of building. He did not offer this information as a complaint. He offered it as a fact, the way a craftsman tallies the cost of a difficult job. I went out once during those 19 days, on the morning of the 8th, to check on an elderly widow who lived at the north end of the main road and had no family nearby. I brought her a small bundle of wood I had set aside and a pot of beans I had cooked the night before, and I walked back through cold that I can only describe as a physical weight, the kind of cold that does not merely surround you but presses on you, that makes the simple act of moving forward feel like an argument you are not certain of winning. My route back took me past the eastern quarter section. I almost did not stop. I was cold and I wanted my stove, and I had already been out longer than I had intended. But something made me slow my steps as I came level with the shallow depression where Marta had built. From the road, there was almost nothing to see. The structure was low enough that the snow had drifted partly over it, softening its already modest outline into the surrounding land. If you did not know it was there, you would not have known it was there. No chimney stack rising above the roofline, the way a cabin chimney rises. Just a narrow clay-lined vent, opening barely above the sod surface, and from it a thin thread of smoke, pale gray against the white sky, rising straight up in the brief windless moment I was watching before the gust took it sideways. One thin thread of smoke. I stood in the cold and looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked back toward town, where I could see from even that distance the heavy, dark columns rising from the chimneys of the timber cabins. Thick smoke, working smoke, the smoke of fires that were consuming fuel as fast as hands could feed them. One thread against many columns. I turned back to the road and walked home, and I did not tell anyone what I had seen that morning for quite some time. I was not sure yet what I had seen exactly. I needed to think about it. On the 19th day, the cold broke. It did not warm gradually. It broke the way glass breaks. One morning, the temperature was 20 below zero, and the next morning it was 18 above, and by afternoon the snow on the south-facing ground had begun to pull back from the edges. Within 3 days, the road east was passable. Within a week, the creek had a trickle of open water at its center. The county came back to itself slowly, the way people do after a long and difficult thing is finally over, cautiously, taking stock, not quite ready to believe the worst has passed. I opened my store on the first full day of the thaw, and did more business than I had done in any single day since the previous summer. People needed everything. They came in with lists and tired faces and the particular quiet that follows a hard shared experience, not celebratory, not yet, but relieved in a way that goes deeper than the surface and takes a while to fully express itself. Jenkins came in mid-morning. He bought nails and timber cord and a quantity of oakum, which told me he had work to do on his cabin before he was satisfied with its condition. He set his purchases on the counter, and we conducted our business, and then he stood there for a moment in the way that meant he wanted to say something, but was working out how. He said, "I went by the Sunkvist place yesterday." I said I was glad to hear it. He said she burned less than half a cord through the whole of it. I did not respond immediately. I knew the number was significant. A timber cabin of standard construction would burn through 4 to 5 cords in a winter like the one we had just had. In the worst weeks of January, a well-stoked stove would consume a full day's worth of cut wood in a single night. Half a cord. Jenkins seemed to understand that I understood because he did not elaborate. He picked up his goods and his change, and he was almost to the door when he stopped and turned around. He said, "That gap she cut at the base of the inner wall. For the moisture." I said yes. He said, "I didn't understand it when I saw it in October. I've been thinking about it for 2 months. It's correct. The physics of it are correct." Then he went out. I stood at my counter for a while after that in the good thin sunlight of the thaw, and I thought about what it costs a craftsman who has spent 25 years learning his trade to say, plainly and without apology, that someone else's solution is correct. I thought it was worth more than he perhaps knew. Clara Hayes was the first to ask Marta directly. Not about theory, not about principles. Clara was not that kind of person. She came to Marta's door in the first week of February with her 2 children and a practical question. She wanted to know specifically how many layers of compressed grass and what thickness of outer clay wall had been used, and whether the same approach could be applied to an existing structure or only to new construction. Marta answered her with the notebook open on the table between them, Ingrid translating when the English ran out. She drew diagrams. She noted measurements. Clara took the diagrams home and showed them to her husband, who looked at them for a long time without speaking, and then asked how soon the ground would be workable enough to start. They began construction on the insulated addition to their cabin in April, when the frost was fully out of the soil. Jenkins helped them. He had arrived one morning with tools and no particular explanation, and had simply begun working, and nobody had thought it necessary to ask him why. By the following autumn, 2 other families in the county had built according to the same method. The autumn after that, I began stocking larger quantities of burlap sacking in September because I had noticed that my supply was regularly exhausted by October, and I did not like running short of things people needed. I never advertised this change. I simply stocked more. The people who needed to know seemed to figure it out. Harold Keene came to see Marta in March of that year. He came alone on a weekday morning, which I know, because he stopped at my store first and asked for her direction, though by that time everyone in the county knew where she lived. I think he stopped at my store because he needed a moment to prepare himself, and a short conversation with a familiar storekeeper is a reasonable way to achieve that. He walked out to the eastern quarter section and knocked on the low timber door frame and waited. Marta opened the door. They stood looking at each other in the thin March light. The snow was retreating. The grass was beginning to show the first pale green at its roots. Keene asked her how many burlap sacks a cabin of 400 square feet would require, and what grade of clay was best suited for exterior wall construction in this county's soil conditions. Marta told him, 18 sacks for the insulation layer. clay-sand mix from the lower banks of the creek, not the topsoil, which was too loose. Pack it in November before the deep freeze set the ground, not in spring when the soil was still releasing moisture from the thaw. Keene listened. He asked 2 follow-up questions, both practical, both specific. She answered them. He thanked her and walked back toward town. That was all. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the previous autumn, no settling of any account other than the practical one he had come to settle. Marta did not require any of those things, or if she did, she kept it to herself, which amounted to the same thing from the outside. I asked her about it once, years later. I asked if it had been enough, that conversation. She thought about the question for a moment in that way she had, taking proper time with it. She said, "He asked me like I knew something worth knowing. That was enough." Cecilia Brandt died in the winter of 1891, in her own house, in her own bed, attended by a neighbor woman who had known her for 30 years. She was 75 years old. The county paper printed 4 lines about her passing. Widow of Werner Brandt, early settler, longtime resident. The notebook passed back to Marta after Cecilia died. The neighbor who handled her effects found it on the kitchen table with Marta's name written on a slip of paper tucked inside the front cover. Neither of them ever explained this arrangement to anyone, and I did not ask. Marta kept the notebook until she died in 1917. Ingrid has it now, as far as I know. She would be in her late 30s, a school teacher in the northern part of the county, serious and quiet in the way her mother had been quiet, and probably for similar reasons. I like to think the notebook is in good hands. I like to think it will not spend another 30 years forgotten in a pine box, waiting for someone to ask the right question, though it might. Such things have a way of hiding in plain sight until the moment they are needed, and then reappearing as though they had been waiting patiently all along. My nephew closed his notebook and sat for a moment in the warm back room of the store. The stove ticked quietly. Outside, the Kansas afternoon had gone gray and still in the way of late November, the land settling into the long wait for spring. He asked me if I ever told this story to anyone else. I said I had told pieces of it. He asked why I had never told it whole. I thought about that for a while. I thought about standing in the road on a January morning in 1884, watching one thin thread of smoke rise from a structure so low and so modest that you could walk past it without knowing it was there, while the rest of the county burned through everything it had trying to stay warm. I said I was not sure I had known, until this afternoon, how it ended. He looked at me. I said, "It ends with you writing it down. That is how it ends. That is the part I had to wait for." He looked at his notebook for a moment. Then he looked back at me. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall on the flat Kansas land, quietly, without announcement, the way all the important things in this part of the world have always arrived.